Good afternoon. We'll get started in about a minute. You can see on the title slide here that there is a URL that will give you access to the documents we'll be using today. They're all labeled 4-14, and there should be 4 of them total. A handout, a prompt in case you aren't familiar with it, the prompt that we'll be looking at today. We do need to read a student essay, so that's in their labeled student sample. And then lastly, 4-14 AP practice for your homework for tonight. So you want to take a few seconds to open those things. You can make a copy or download them, and then we'll get started. All right, good afternoon. Hello, thank you for coming. Today we're going to have 4 documents we'll be working with, a handout in case you want to download or make a copy of it so you can take notes as we move along. A prompt, it's the Madeline Albright prompt that you might already be familiar with. Open it only if you haven't read it before. I do have a student essay that we're going to look at today, so you can open that. It's labeled 4-14 student sample for lesson. And then lastly, the 4-14 AP practice. I am Emily Velitis. I'm an English teacher outside of Chicago. Good to see you guys. I've been here maybe for the last 5 or 6 sessions or so, but Mrs. Knight will be returning tomorrow and Thursday. So I have about 2 days off, and I have some really exciting plans over the next 2 days. My husband is a fool, and he has requested that I give him a haircut over the next 2 days. So I'll report back on Friday how it goes. I have never cut any hair, a dog's hair, a human's head, nothing. He might end up looking like this. So we will see. I am for sure not letting him cut my hair, so we're safe there. But I have some big plans over the next 2 days. I have some time writings that my students are completing tomorrow, and then I'm going to try to cut some hair. So I've got a busy 2 days. All right, before we get started, just a review of yesterday. If you didn't watch, just pay attention and think, how does this pertain to me? We operated under this lens of what is something good to do in my writing, and that's typically something that'll be done really quickly. It will demonstrate an adequate or a competent knowledge of the task. It's good. It gets the job done. We also talked about how you can take that and turn it into something that's great, that shows some enrichment or extension, that you are going beyond just the basics of the prompt or the task. It will reflect more sophistication. There are 2 roads you can travel down, the good road or the great road. Both are wonderful. And that a lot of it really depends on your time management and how well you understand the prompt or the passage that you are looking at. So we started by looking at the thesis statement, and that a good thesis statement usually will be about 1 full sentence of 2 devices the writer will use, something you can point to. It'll be a noun, so we'll usually start with a or an, like an allusion, a simile. It will include the name of the writer. It will have some sort of rhetorically strong verb. It's not going to use something lame like uses. It will also include the purpose and the message. However, if you've got time and you understand the passage well, you might strive for a great thesis statement. That's when you're shifting from what the writer uses to more of what are 2 or 3 strategies the writer has taken when approaching this task of writing. Those 2 will usually, since they are something a writer does, they're verbs. They will start with a verb, not a or an. And it might be speaking to the appeal. So a larger idea might be speaking to the strategies or the chronology of the piece, the ideas, and how they move from beginning to end. Or it could just be methods, and again, those strategies. It too would include the name of the writer and the message. So here's a sample. I asked for you guys to write your own thesis statement or revise one that you wrote on Thursday or Friday, excuse me. And I think that if you kind of keep that checklist in mind, that would help you to kind of determine which thesis statement best pertains to me, the good or the great. But to give you an example, here's one thesis statement. I'm going to ask for you to pause the recording, read through it, and think, based on that criteria, is this a good or a great thesis statement and why? So think about that checklist. What is the student doing or including? Is it driven by devices or is it driven by strategies? And then decide what makes it good or great. So pause the recording and I'll meet you back here in about 30 seconds. All right, welcome back. This thesis statement, I would describe it as a great thesis statement, especially when you look at the choices here. The student is using strategies, and we know that because, again, they start with a verb, by highlighting and by acknowledging. So the student has two clear strategies. The student is still giving, still analyzing the rhetorical strategies or choices that the writer uses, but this student has chosen to use strategies. They start with verbs. The student also includes the writer, which we know that both would do. The student has a transitional phrase, and we talked yesterday about what that might look like. It might be a strong verb. It might be the word by, or the word by. It might be something like in order to. A lot of my students tend to use the in order to. So there's a transitional phrase, and then the student transitions into the message at the end. So this thesis statement is going beyond just identifying two or three things the writer uses and shifting into the uses. I did get a really good email from a student yesterday who tracked me down, was a good Google searcher, tracked me down, and asked if I could clarify what a message meant. You might see this as like the argument, depending on what language your teacher has used, but it is kind of like the argument here. So what she's doing is her purpose is to commemorate his memory in order to encourage the audience to remember how he was a great man and president. Some of you might think of that more as like the argument. Okay, so for today, we've talked about the intro and then narrowed into the thesis. It only makes sense that we talk about that bottom hamburger bun in our sandwich, that we're looking at conclusions and how to write a sophisticated conclusion for a rhetorical analysis essay. I advised you before that your intro should take no more than 5 minutes to write. The same is true with your conclusion. Take no more than 5 minutes to write it. However, conclusions are so hard to write, primarily because you tend to run out of time by the end of the essay. You run out of time and you just have to slap something down at the end of your essay. I think that today, the message that I will impart to you is to strive for a great conclusion. Be cognizant of what you need to do to have a great conclusion, but also know that if you're panicking at the end of the essay and you look at the clock on the wall or you see on your watch that you only have 2 minutes left to write before you have to upload your essay, just put something down. Good is 100% fine when it comes to a conclusion. Just make sure you have one. I know sometimes students run out of time and they don't get one. Conclusions are important. That's your last moment with the reader. So when we're talking about your credibility and maybe appealing to pathos, this is your last opportunity to do that. And if you don't have a conclusion and you just end at the body paragraph, it just leaves your reader with like a, you want your reader to leave inspired and refreshed. So most of you will only have time for a good conclusion, which is wonderful. It's totally fine. But just make sure you don't skip it. All right, so the good, I'm assuming you are already familiar with, but basically it's going to bring a unified end to the essay, and it may present the argument's thesis. Typically what this means to students is that it's 1 to 2 sentences and it's summarizing the essay. You're going to restate the major claims. You might revisit your thesis statement. I think my biggest tip for you is if you are going to simply go with a good conclusion, go back and look at your introduction, review it to make sure that your ideas are still, on the same path. but make sure you're using new words and that you're not simply restating the same words over and over again. Change up the language, primarily because if your reader didn't understand it in the introduction, if you use the exact same words in the conclusion, your reader might still have questions. So try to use different words to capture the same ideas. Again, this is what most students will do. They'll get to the end of their essay, they're running out of intellectual steam, they're tired, they're panicked, for this year, you might be worried about getting it uploaded in time. A good conclusion is just fine. It's permissible. It's totally fine. However, if you are striving for a great conclusion, it's similar to the introduction. You will want to engage or focus your audience. You're going beyond just the restatement or a summarizing of the essay. And a great conclusion, if a good conclusion is about 1 to 2 sentences, a great conclusion is more like a 3 to 5 sentence paragraph. You might see some overlap here. College Board and Advanced Placement will give you some descriptions of what you can do to engage or focus your audience. And you might see some overlap here. And some of these won't pertain to the rhetorical analysis. So I'm going to go through the ones that I think are the most important for you to consider for your rhetorical analysis essay. The others are great. They might just be pertaining more toward the argument essay. So the first way I think that you can go about engaging or focusing your audience is explaining the significance of the argument within a broader context, making connections, explain the implications, and or summarizing the argument. I like to lump all those together and just label them the larger significance. That one way you can move into a great conclusion is to explore the larger significance in the conclusion. So what that means is, let's go just step by step. Explain the significance of the argument within a broader context is looking at what are some of those larger issues being exposed in the text itself. So think impact, think the big picture, the larger scale of the issues. In the Madeleine Albright, I think you could look at women's rights, and that's the larger issue. It's not just about fighting for equality, it's about women's rights and how they are human rights. So it's a natural extension. It's something that's being explored through the subject matter, the content of the speech itself. So just kind of pull back and think, what is the broader context here? The next one, making connections, that's going to be between issues or situations, and it could even be in between your choices. Like, how do these choices play off of each other? What connections could you make between the choices that the writer has made? I think that it's maybe more realistic for you guys in your conclusion to think about the connections between issues. So for Madeleine Albright, again, if she's starting to argue, or if you think the broader context is fighting for equality and that gender rights are human rights, you might also even at this point make a connection to another text that states all men are created equal, the Declaration of Independence. So if someone were to make a connection and a conclusion, they might relate it to another text or a larger idea, like again, the suffragettes, or that all men are created equal. They're making connections between what the text is saying and something else. Explain the implications is a good one. This is something that you would really be using in an argument essay, but I think it could work here with a rhetorical analysis. An implication is typically like, what's a possible effect or outcome or result, even if it's unintentional, to this piece, this text. So thinking about what is the potential effect that arises because of this. It might be tough in a letter, but easier in a speech, because usually a speech is for a larger group. So if we were to think about the Madeleine Albright prompt, one of the implications that might emerge is that the fight for equality will benefit themselves and others. It could also be exploring what happens if they don't engage in this fight or have high expectations for themselves. And it might be something like progress would be inhibited. So an implication could be, what is a negative consequence if they don't heed this advice? Summarizing the argument is kind of obvious. It's just summarizing the issues that are associated with it. This, again, the subject matter. So like women's rights in general, human rights. And I think the one thing I would encourage you guys to do with your tips down below is avoid leaps in logic. I had 2 conferences with my students this morning, one-on-one conferences to talk about their writing. And one thing I kept saying to them is, think about what is the subject matter of the piece and make sure the larger significance fits within that framework. So avoid this Miss America answer of like, ultimately, Madeleine Albright is trying to argue for a government that is just. That might be something that you could infer, but it's going to take a lot of proving for you to do that you just don't have time for in the conclusion. So make sure it's related to the subject matter and you're avoiding this major leap in logic. If you get a passage on May 20th that's about nature, make sure the larger significance has something to do with nature. If it's about technology, make sure the larger significance has something to do with technology. And then make sure you have strong transitions. And if you're keeping it brief, then it shouldn't need any kind of support. All right, another way you could go about taking a good conclusion into that great realm is to leave the audience with a compelling image. And to do this, think about the writer's imagery that you're studying for rhetorical analysis. Imagery will have very vivid language. It will address all of the senses, sight, sound, smell, etc., and that they're meant to appeal to pathos. So think about how what you've been studying, you could do yourself in the conclusion. Really try to set the scene of the issue itself. Again, try to keep it brief though. You don't want it to overtake the ideas of the essay. So for Madeleine Albright, I think one image that could maybe work in a conclusion would be kind of painting the picture of women joined together in a major metropolitan city, marching with signs to fight for women's rights. It still is related. It's not going to be a major leap in logic, but it will kind of flex your own rhetorical muscles a little bit. It'll show you as a more nuanced writer. All right, and then the last thing that I think is pretty common for students is to connect to the introduction. It should be an explicit connection. It should be very clear and obvious. It shouldn't be just a like, hey, did the student do that or not? And you would only want to do this if you have a really unique element in your introduction. And if you need to go back and review our session from Friday, we talk about how you can have a really engaging introduction. If you have a compelling image in the intro, mimic that in the end. Again, kind of like sandwich it at the end in your conclusion. If you have a really striking statement in the intro, try to have a similar striking statement in the end. Make sure they're conceptually related. Just restating your thesis isn't going to work. That's what a good conclusion would do. Really do it justice. If you're going to connect your intro, really commit to it. And don't do it if your intro doesn't have that type of an element within. You might even also want to go back to review your introduction to see, do I have something that's striking, that's memorable, that I should be addressing in the end? Okay, so let's look at a sample. Because it is a conclusion, you have to read a student essay to know how the student possibly could end it. So I've given you one in your files for today. This is a student essay. It's not perfect by any means. Try not to critique it too much in terms of like the evidence or the commentary. Instead, I want you to really focus on the introduction and what the writer's doing in the introduction, and then read the body paragraphs just to understand the main idea. So then when we get to the conclusion, we can evaluate, did the student adequately summarize the essay or not? So go ahead and pause the recording. Take a few seconds. I think in this point, realistically, it'll be more like 2 or 3 minutes to read the sample, and then return, and I'll give you a series of conclusions, potential conclusions to look at for this essay, and we'll evaluate each of them. All right, so here's one conclusion that you might have seen at the end of this essay. The student would write, In her commencement address to the graduating class of Mount Holyoke College, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright models the power women can yield. By contrasting hypotheticals with reality, providing anecdotes of women facing adversity, and encouraging the graduates to persevere, Albright motivates and inspires the women to make a difference regardless of challenges they faced. In your opinion, is that a good or a great conclusion, and why? Hopefully you guys would all agree that this is a good conclusion because it really is just summarizing the essay itself. It's hitting those major elements of the rhetorical situation. It's reviewing the rhetorical choices that the student made in his or her essay. It's good. I would, again, be very satisfied with this. I think that it's an appropriate conclusion and something a lot of you will end up doing just naturally because you run out of time. So it's a fine conclusion. Let me show you two other samples, and I will tell you that these are both great, but I want you to read them to identify why are they great. Which of those techniques have been applied to these particular conclusions to make them great. You will notice that there's some similarities and that they have the same summary because they are attached to the same essay, so they should have the same summary. But look at what has been added to each conclusion to make it great. And then again, what technique did the student take or use in this particular conclusion to make it great? Pause the recording, read through them, and think about which technique each used to make their conclusion great. Let's start with sample A. Again, it's a great conclusion. I think the primary reason why it's so great is because it's really connecting to the introduction. The introduction makes reference to voting rights and gender equality. So we do see a little bit about the larger significance, but that otherwise it's not it's not as much of the larger significance. The student's not exploring those larger issues. It's really connecting to that notion of breaking the glass ceiling. We see a direct connection. The first essay of the first sentence, sorry, of the whole essay is essentially rewritten here in the conclusion about making advances in gender equality. So the student has kind of mirrored the end with the beginning, a really clear connection to the introduction, but the issues aren't really there as much. So I just did an underline under the larger significance. You might have seen it. I do see elements of it, but I don't know that it's strong enough for me to fully highlight. All right, sample B is also great, but this time it's different. It's great for a different reason. I think that this student does a really nice job of setting that scene, making a compelling image, specifically of the young women clad in their caps and gowns and anxious for an uncertain world. I think you could also make the case that it's not really a compelling image, but it's speaking to style by using that simile of her words were a beacon to guide their future, that comparing her words to this like light, this thing that's propelling them into the future. I also like that both of those things, they're not a far stretch. That's an image that we could picture in the text of those young women sitting in this larger audience listening to Madeleine Albright. The student sets that scene a little bit more. Okay, so just to review, a good conclusion is what most of you will be doing. It's 1 to 2 sentences. It's summarizing the essay without using the exact same words. So don't just restate, put it into your own words. Whereas a great conclusion is going to be more like 3 to 5 sentences. It too will summarize the essay, but it will go beyond that. And it will at least include the larger significance, the compelling image, or a connection to the introduction. It would do one of those things. The way they could attach or explore the larger significance could be through the broader context, making connections, or explaining the implications. Okay, so your AP practice should be obvious. Take that same student sample, and I want you to craft your own conclusion for the Margaret Thatcher passage, the eulogy that she delivered for Ronald Reagan's passing. limit yourself just to 5 minutes, because that's, I think, realistic to what you would have on May 20th for the AP exam. Limit yourself to 5 minutes. If you need to reread the passage, go right ahead, but construct either a good or a great conclusion using the knowledge gained from this session. And then I will not see you till Friday, but Mrs. Knight will be here tomorrow. And she'll debrief and go over a few sample conclusions that you could be using in use for this particular prompt. All right, have a great day. Good to see you. I'll see you on Friday.